Hi, my name is Jorge Torres. I'm the CEO and co-founder of MindsDB. And I'm here to talk to you about what we've learned so far in the journey of raising our seed round, as well as kind of guiding you through those lessons, hopefully to help anyone that is going through the same journey of starting an open source startup, as well as understanding what it needs to take to raise the initial seed rounds. The first thing about open source seed rounds learnings is how we now understand that investors try to break down the conversation to address the risks that they think they need to mitigate, or to at least understand very well to make their decision. And investors may have many different models, but we believe that you can boil down most of those risks into three main risks. The first one is team risk, market risk, and execution risk. And of course, there might be other ones, but most likely you will be able to still fit most of the conversation within these three. And if you manage to communicate and address each one of those in a very concise manner, is not only important for you as a founder, but it will be a successful path for you to have those conversations with investors. Of course, they want to make investments that are low risk, high reward. And if on the conversation you can explain why the risk that they're taking is low, then I think that it will just make it much easier for you. Let's start with the market risk. The very first thing that investors want to understand is that the problem that you're solving will generate enough revenue to make your company be a company that is valued more than $1 billion. I know the bar for this is changing, and it will continue to go higher as companies will have bigger and bigger exits. But $1 billion is a good start point for the conversations that you're going to have with investors in the early stage. That doesn't mean that for the early stage round that you're raising, you have to achieve that valuation. That will be crazy, but at least you have to convey down the horizon how is it possible. And the best way for you to address this, in our opinion, is to communicate very clearly how is it that your company is going to generate $100 million in revenue a year. Roughly speaking, if that is the revenue amount that you have, you're roughly valuated at $1 billion. Now, there are different things that happen here for a traditional startup and an open core startup. A traditional startup has a higher barrier here to convey that market risk. Mostly because it is also based on assumptions. So investors on a traditional startup are making a huge leap of faith when they believe on the market assessments of the entrepreneur. The open core startup has a few advantages, however. Hopefully, if you're going down the path of being an open core startup, there are other startups that are your competitors that are not open source. And hopefully you're the only one that is going down the open source route. And hopefully those open source startups are actually in a later stage than you are. Because if that is the case, you can bring this information to the table for yourself, as well as for the conversations that you have with investors, to communicate that other investors have already validated this market risk for them. And especially if they're going in the later stage, they're already validating that their assumptions are real or not. And you will like your competitors to be generating significant revenue in this case. That means that other investors have already kind of gone through the process of evaluating that the math for the market size is a real one, and that the essential kind of market drivers exist for the problem that you're trying to solve. And again, your differentiator here is that by being open source, you're different. You also have to address, why that is the case, and make sure that for your startup, that is a very precise answer, and an answer that is backed, again, by your understanding of the industry. In our case, we have competitors like the Robot Data IQ. They've raised huge rounds, and they are in a huge market. And we were the kind of like the alternative to those solutions in the open source game, even though we also understand a few things different. But once you kind of have conveyed what is the important element of the market risk, you have to jump very quickly into the execution risk. How is it that you're going to execute that plan to get into that type of revenue? And here again, there are differences between the traditional startup and the open core startup. Let me elaborate a little bit more. In a traditional startup, you have very few arrows, if you may. Imagine that at the end, you have to get to that milestone of $100 million in revenue. And in a traditional startup, it feels that you only have one arrow. And this is because the iterative process that you have to go to generate those revenues and to validate your product is a validation process that involves very few opportunities to iterate. Essentially, when your customers are already paying for something, they have very little flexibility on what you're offering. And if you fail to build a product that can scale to a broader audience with the very first iterations that you have, you may run out of capital before you can actually change gears. And this is very dangerous. And therefore, the execution risk for a traditional startup from the get-go is much higher than from the open core startup. On the other hand, if you kind of go through the same analogy, you have not just one arrow, you have many arrows. And your key advantage here is speed of execution. You have a community, hopefully, and if the community believes in what you have, you can attach yourself to a metric that allows you to understand how much the community is validating that the path that you're taking to the implementation and executing that strategy is the right one. And here you can iterate on this very fast. Many open core startups start with just the idea and communicating this to a specific community. And if you have traction just with the idea, then you can have traction on the implementation. And not only that, since this community is not paying initially for it, they're eager to give you feedback, which is very different from customers that have paid for something and you don't deliver to their initial expectation. And since there are many, many, many more that are willing to try it for free, then you're getting a lot of feedback. And hopefully, if you're very clever on this path, you can try to get the signals of traction to sway your direction into the path that is going to get you to that bullseye. So execution risk for the open core startup is much lower. And if you can convey that metric of adoption within the community to your investors correctly, make it GitHub stars, whatever it is that you're measuring to understand if you're having a fit of your solution with a specific need within the community, then your execution risk and the story of your execution risk all of a sudden is much, much lower than if you were going the other path. So this is crucial. Now, the last element that you want to convey to your investors is founder's risk. And of course, founder's risk is very similar between a traditional startup and an open core startup. However, I think that here it is very crucial to understand that is very tight or is very linked, intertwined, if you may, to the execution risk in the open core startup game. If the founders have managed to build a community, that in itself is the greatest letter of introduction of the founders and the capacity of the founders to be those founders to execute a vision and a mission. So it is intertwined to the execution. Of course, there is a risk that is impossible for you to communicate via the open core startup, any different from the one that you have to communicate in the traditional startup, which is, are these founders going to stick together? However, since there is a lot of speed in the execution of an open core startup, you have to go through many failures together to actually get into a traction metric that works. I mean, likely would be that you're going to be iterating so much so that you have to have this constant communication with your founders about the path that you're going. And that in itself has to show a lot for this founder risk. I think that by now, the main takeaway that we want to give to you is that if you have an idea, and this idea can fit within the open core, the risks that you're going to have to communicate to your investors for a seed stage round, from our experiences, are much lower than if you were going down the traditional route. I hope that this quick presentation helps you if you are walking into the steps, and please do reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much.